Her key publications include Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, Oxford University Press, New Delhi, 2011, and Affirmative Action in India, Oxford University Press, New Delhi, Oxford India Short Introduction Series, 2013. Also, she has received prestigious awards such as the EXIM Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation in 1994 and the 2007 VKRV Rao Award for Indian Economists Under 45. She will be delivering the lecture on the topic, the gendered impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in India. A gentle reminder for all participants to remain muted throughout the lecture. Please change your layout of the screen to focus stage to the button on the top right corner of your screen for a better experience. Post the talk, participants can raise their hands and our team members will recognize you to ask questions. You can also put your questions on the question and answer option, but please remember to choose the all co-host option when you post questions. The talk will be recorded for archival purposes. The use of derogatory or offensive language will attract strict actions. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ashwini Deshpande.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I apologize for the late time. It was a mix-up and I got double booked and I just finished another event literally 5 or 10 minutes back. But I'm glad that I made it. I'm going to keep it short to allow you to ask questions and have a more interactive session. Now, this center that I had, CEDA, Center for Economic Data and Analysis, we have a website in which we publish regular commentaries on the economic impact of COVID-19 as it has unfolded. Not just the economic impact of COVID-19, we also are publishing other commentaries on just socioeconomic data on India. We have a data portal now which we are developing, which is already, by the way, up, where we look at the where we've generated summary statistics from the National Sample Survey, National Family and Health Survey, and 2 censuses. And the data portal allows you to make connections between variables across geography, across time, and across data sets. So do go to our website, look at the feature, look at this data portal, and use it for your dissertations, etc. So having said that, I had a paper which was recently out, which looked at the impact of the first wave of COVID, because the lockdown. Why the first wave is because there was such a strict lockdown and economic activity came to a halt, it was possible to look at the before and after picture more clearly during the first wave. By the time the second wave came around, first, the impact of the second wave varied from region to region. Secondly, the lockdown also, there were restrictions on economic activity, but it wasn't a very strict lockdown. So it was hard to disentangle in terms of just estimation issues. It was hard to disentangle the effect of COVID per se from an overall slowdown in the economy. Whereas in the first wave, we were able to do that. So what I do in this paper is I've used the CMI Center for Monitoring Indian Economy data for Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, the CPHS data. And if you know about the CMI data, then it's really every 4 months they repeat their survey. So it's a panel data, it's a longitudinal data, where every household is interviewed 3 times in a year. So you get information about the employment status and many other characteristics for the same set of individuals over time in this very quick frequency data, which is very useful to analyze changes in real time. And what happened with the CMI is that even when the lockdown happened, they were able to continue their survey because they have experienced surveyors and they switched to a phone survey, etc., etc. So we were able to identify households that were interviewed in the month of the strictest lockdown, which is April 2020. Because 25th of March was the lockdown, April 2020 was the strictest period of the lockdown. And because it's a panel, if you identify individuals interviewed in April 2020, you can go back in time, look at the outcomes of those individuals back in time, and then go forward in time. And that's exactly what I did. And there's a estimation methodology called difference in differences. So these are male female differences across, pre post COVID. And when I say post COVID, obviously the COVID has not ended, but basically after the onset of COVID is what post COVID means. And pre COVID is obviously before the onset of COVID. So the sample that was interviewed in April 2020 by CMIE was the last round of interview was in December 2019, right? Before that, August 2019. Before that, April 2019. So it's the same group of individuals that are getting interviewed every 4 months. So the first impact that I looked at in that paper was on employment. And the CMI data measures employment very strictly. It just asks, it's like a daily status of NSS, right? If you're used to the National Sample Survey, then it just basically asks yesterday, one day before the survey, were you employed or not? So were you employed? Were you unemployed and looking for work? Were you unemployed and willing to work? Were you unemployed, not looking for work, not willing to work, right? So these are the 4 categories they asked for. And using that variable, you can look at changes in the employment pattern of men and women in April 2020, earlier than April 2020, and later, every time that they were interviewed. And so I basically have 6 rounds, six observations. I mean, data were released even later on for 2021, but in this particular paper, I don't use that because I wanted to look at exactly the effect of the lockdown, of the strictest lockdown, right? So what are the main results? So when you look at the fall in employment in April 2020, when the lockdown was really strict, if you look at just the absolute numbers of people who lost employment, then more men lost employment in April 2020 compared to women. But that is because there were already pre-existing gaps in employment prior to the lockdown. So this, I'm sure, that men have a much greater labor force participation rate in India than women do, and higher, higher employment rates than women do. So more men were employed before the pandemic than women. And so when you look at the drop in employment in April 2020, in absolute terms, more men lost jobs than women. But when you control for the, when you look at individuals who were employed before the pandemic, then conditional on being employed before the pandemic, women were disproportionately negatively impacted in August 2020, which is the first quarter that you see the same women who were interviewed in April 2020. So while the absolute loss of jobs for men was greater, in relative terms, women were more disproportionately impacted. Even by the time you come to December, even though women's employment and men's employment also had gone back kind of the pre-pandemic phase, but women continued to be disadvantaged relative to men, conditional on their status before the pandemic. The second factor, which has come into play more in 2021 than in 2020, is the fact that schools in India have they've just opened now. So basically, they've been closed for close to 2 years. This is amongst the highest days of school closure anywhere in the world. I think only Uganda is higher than India in terms of the number of days that schools were shut. What that meant was that children had to be homeschooled. And of course, here there's a big class divide, which is that not all children studying from home have access to digital technology, mobile phones, computers, where they can access the school lessons. So, but in houses where there was at least one smartphone, the boys' education got more priority compared to girls. And this is not so much from CMI, but it's coming out from the ASR report, from many of the other data sources. So there's that gendered angle as well. But the second gendered angle was that wherever children were homeschooling, mothers were primarily responsible for making sure that children were sitting in on classes and learning. And this is true not just of India, but elsewhere in the world as well. That whenever schools shut down, and they did initially in all countries of the world, women were primarily responsible for supervising homeschooling. So you find, for example, in the United States, women who had jobs, who were not laid off, their companies continue to work from home. The women could also work from home. But the pressure of supervising children, the pressure of supervising homeschooling of children, and domestic chores, and doing the responsibilities of their individual jobs meant that they just couldn't cope with the pressure. And women actually started dropping out of the labor force in the United States. So, in fact, in countries like the United States, in absolute numbers, more women dropped out of the labor force or lost jobs compared to men. They dropped out because of the reasons that I just explained, and losing jobs happened because the sectors that were especially disadvantaged were sectors in which women work predominantly. So, for example, the hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, etc. These were shut for months on end, even when other kinds of economic activity resumed. Hospitality industry employs a large number of women. Malls, retail spaces, all of these sectors also employ a large number of women. All the care work, the nannies, the maids who go in, uh, elderly care homes, etc., play schools, creches, most of these employ women. So sectors that employ women in large numbers were faced the brunt of COVID because A, they were not considered essential service. B, they were, because of the needs of social distancing. These were the sectors where social distancing was not possible. And it's only now that you see that some of these sectors are coming up. And this has been another gendered angle of the lockdown. What about domestic chores? So, domestic chores, um, India has amongst the most unequal divisions of work as far as domestic work is concerned, where women do as much as 10 times more, put in 10 times more hours of work compared to men. And this is a serious problem because it also prevents them from accessing paid work when paid work is available. Of course, a lot of the times it's not available because there aren't enough jobs being created, and the jobs that are being created, many of them are not suitable for women, etc. So there are all of those issues. Um, in April 2020, the month of the strictest lockdown, CMI dataset also has a question of how many hours did you spend doing domestic chores? It's a very general question. It's not very specific or not very detailed, but it's a self-reported number of hours. And so for the sample that was interviewed in April 2020, I also have the information for December 2019, right? And there I find that the gap between male and female hours of work, as is expected, women were putting in much more hours of work than men were doing. In April 2020, when domestic helpers also stopped coming, to homes, and people were just locked down, all economic activity was completely shut. You've started seeing pictures on WhatsApp and social media in middle class households of men proudly displaying their, jhadus or going into the kitchen, cooking, etc., etc. So, and that shows up in the CMI data in the sense that the gap between the male and female hours of work declined in that month, and that suddenly seemed like, oh, maybe there's some change in gender norms or gender relations inside the household, and it seemed promising that, oh, in April 2020, the gap in women were still doing more, but men had stepped up, right? But alas, that turned out to be just green shoots, which didn't really grow much further, because by the time August came along, women's hours had gone up and men's hours had declined. By the time you come to December, that's exactly 1 year, December 2019, and the earlier data set, December 2020 was the second one. By the time you come to December, the gap has widened compared to pre-pandemic. So women were doing more housework than they were doing before the pandemic, and men were doing less. So not just that the gap didn't reverse, it actually increased. So, I mean, the explanations, we can think about what those explanations are, but, it could be that women were, had lost jobs more, and so they were at home, or anyway, they were supervising the children. So men probably said, okay, since you're at home anyway, there's no reason for us to do the work, etc., etc. So in terms of the gender division of domestic chores, there was a slight closing of the gap, which looked promising, which looked hopeful. But by the time you come to December 2020, that it was a mirage that didn't really actually take off. So overall, the picture that you see as as a result of the first wave of the pandemic is that the gender gaps in employment initially worsened. Now, after that, they were back to sort of their pre-pandemic level. Subsequently, as the economy has gone up and down in terms of its movement, in terms of its growth, women's employment has also fluctuated. You can find the trend on the CEDA website. But it's certainly not any better than it was pre-pandemic. In terms of domestic chores, unfortunately, it's worse. Again, the only data we have is from CMI. We don't have any other data. So, but using that data set, unfortunately, the situation is worse now. I haven't looked at the very latest data, but it was worse immediately after the pandemic. Other gendered aspects of the pandemic include the fact that if you look at the frontline health workers, the ASHA workers, the Anganwadi workers, the ANMs, these are all women, right? And these are women who didn't lose their jobs. So there wasn't a labor market shock in that sense for these women. But they were our first point of contact of the population with the health system. And so they perform an extremely important role. And their importance was even more, came to light during the pandemic. But they are pitifully poorly paid. They are supposedly government employees, but they're paid nowhere near what a government public sector employee would be paid. So their base rates are, 3,000 to 4,000 rupees a month, and they get a bonus, which half the time they don't get on time. So often you see them, currently in Delhi, for example, there's been a huge strike of the ASHA Anganwadi workers because they didn't get their bonuses on time, which is unfortunate because they do an absolutely they play a very, very critical role in terms of COVID, spread, contact tracing, and in very hazardous conditions, if I may add, being subjected to stigma, being subjected to attacks, including from their own families and communities, because they feel that they've been out and they've been in touch with people who might have had COVID, etc., etc. So that's the other. That's also a gendered impact because these frontline health workers who play such a crucial role are actually women. So either women have lost employment, or even when they haven't lost employment, their conditions of work have been very, very precarious, hazardous, poorly paid, with no regulation of working hours, no safety in terms of protection against COVID, etc. And the final component of the gendered impact is, of course, domestic violence. Now, again, in data on domestic violence in India comes very late, so we don't have data in real time. But elsewhere in the world, there is, the spread, the increase in domestic violence as a result of the pandemic was termed by UN Women as the shadow pandemic. So as the COVID-19 pandemic spread, in its wake, the shadow pandemic spread. That basically that's happened is because during periods of lockdown, women were locked in with their abusers at home, and initially the the complaint cell, the police, the shelters, etc., were not declared as essential service. So they had to be shut. Then there was some hue and cry by the National Commissions of Women, by the women's organizations, and then they declared them as essential service. But even to access a shelter, or the police or the authorities, it's very difficult to do that during the pandemic. Women's access to contraception reduced because again, it's shut down. You are going to the chemist, people will ask, what are you going for, what do you need to get, etc. So basically a lot of these features that women already face constraints, face difficulties in accessing, the pandemic made it worse. So initially, for the first week, by the way, even sanitary napkins were not in the list of essential items. Imagine that, because men sitting in Delhi were making these rules, and it didn't even occur to them to realize that. And so for a week, the supply of sanitary napkins was heavily disrupted because factories producing the sanitary napkins couldn't work because sanitary napkins, the product, was not considered essential service. So after 1 week, this was brought to light, then it was included. But by the time that happened, the factories had been shut for about 10 days or so, then to get the workers back. So it did lead to disrupted service, and disrupted supply of sanitary napkins, which then women had to use some indigenous, method. And that led to, infections, disease, shame inside the household. So all kinds of, so these are a huge number of some very obvious gendered impacts like employment, where everybody's talking about it, but there are also these on the ground, under the surface, a lot of these other impacts which often people are not sensitive to. They don't think about these issues a lot. So I will end by saying that we have to have a gendered lens. And when I say women, I'm thinking of women, I'm saying women as if it's a homogeneous category, but we know, of course, that not all categories of women are equal. There are class differences, there are caste differences, and Dalit women, for example, bear the double burden of being women, as well as of their, stigmatization on account of their caste. So anything that I'm saying is even harder when you have intersecting identities that are marginalized identities. So what I would like to end by saying is that we need a gendered lens, not just gendered lens, but an intersectional lens to assess the negative consequences of COVID, which is not the incidence of COVID per se, but all these other associated consequences. And when we are resetting economic policy, we must have this lens to think about and reset economic policies eventually that reduce inequalities that were pre-existing from COVID. So we shouldn't think that all these inequalities were created by COVID. No. They were exacerbated by COVID. But it would be, since we are already in a process of rethinking, it would be a good idea for us to now pause and say, okay, we had these problems from earlier, and what can be done to get these to sort out these sort of long-standing issues of inequality and inegalitarian gender practices. So let me stop here and take questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for the lecture. We'll now be taking questions. You can either raise your hands or you can type them in the chat box.
I seem to have convinced everybody. That's great. No, I know it's been a long day for everyone. I'm sure you're also exhausted. So I totally understand that, if people want to call end this evening and think about these issues, I'm happy to email the PDF of the paper to you in case anybody wants to read that. So I can do that. And all right. I think there are no questions. That's excellent. And yeah, the data set is just ceda.ashoka.edu.in. That's the portal. So, please visit it. And yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Then. So thank you all. Thank you, ma'am, for the lecture. It was very interesting. And I would once again like to thank Professor Ashwini Deshpande on behalf of the annual academic conference of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras team, for spending time with us this evening. We will forever remain grateful for the valuable time you spent with us this evening despite your hectic schedule. And also thanks to all the participants. Tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m., we'll feature a keynote lecture by Professor Scott Slovic on the topic Narrative Contagion, the Possibilities and Pitfalls of Pro and Antisocial Stories, and papers spread across 3 panels titled Contagion and Gender Identities, Contagion and Literature, and Contagion, State, Civil Society, and Identity Entanglement. Hoping to see you all tomorrow. Good night. Thank you, ma'am.